This week on the Superhuman Podcast.
Basically their homework assistant. And you think about how that's going to change and how it's going to be inbuilt.
How do I know what the art of the possible is with this technology until I really start to embed it into my workflow?
When you're a subject matter expert and you can think about how that technology is going to help you, that's where you're going to unlock massive gains.
Buyer beware, there is potential threat and opportunity on the side of brand new businesses coming in that are going to hurt you, but don't necessarily waste your time just on the big picture thinking.
And I think I'm right in saying that around 90% of New Zealand primary and secondary use the Google tooling. When we make this available to that market, we absolutely get it right.
Paul is the New Zealand country manager of Google. On the back of Google I/O and the AI race heating up between all the major players, we speak with Paul on the real-world use cases of Gemini and what Google has in store for the coming months. So I'm fresh from watching the Google I/O event. Watched it live and watched a repeat of it as well. Did you have the luxury of watch it twice? Yeah. Too much good stuff. Did you have the luxury of being flown over, or were you a remote viewer like me?
No, I was a remote viewer. It was pretty good. What were your takeaways?
Yeah. The speed at which all of you guys, and I say all of you guys, the major cloud providers, the hyperscalers are moving is, it's great to see the capital at work. And it does make me feel slightly envious that down in this little part of the world, there's just not that much capital at work to do that kind of that speed of development. How much of it is real across all the players, I think is yet to be seen. But a couple of things that were key takeaways from me. I mean, Google's focus on the consumer side of AI, I think, is far more evident than all of the other hyperscale providers. And I think that's fair to say from the footprint. Obviously, AWS are focusing on AI within the developer community, Microsoft from the business perspective, and then Google seemingly that barrier between more consumer and then blending up into enterprise. The stuff that's happening on Android and devices, I think, is the most advanced UI, but I don't mean UI in the sense of probably more just the AI experiences that are coming. Yet to see anything from Apple really within that space. Samsung are kind of getting there, but like from an Android perspective, that OS is really starting to be very, very AI powered. All the stuff around photo imaging, but not the creation of the inbuilt semantic search of image was pretty powerful. Probably the most advanced I've seen. But yeah, that was my kind of key takeaways. What about you? What's floating your boat?
Yeah, I like the consumer angle. So AI's been around for a while. You know that, I know that. Seeing it in the consumer world, and we've got OpenAI, ChatGPT to thank for that. They launched something that really caught the imagination of the consumers. And I think we're a beneficiary. So Google, as you no doubt know, has a number of applications with hundreds of millions, if not billions of users. That's an opportunity for us to bring our AI to the consumer. And you've mentioned photos, you're seeing it in Gmail, you see it across a bunch of our properties, which is a great place for us to learn, and a great place for us to test, because the step from that to enterprise isn't a big step. You tend to see the innovations come in the consumer world, and that gradually trickles across over a period of time into the enterprise. So from my perspective, I/O, phenomenally exciting. Mm-hmm. Everyone talks about a race. It's not a race. It's developing technology, and the difference between one organization and another coming out with a particular feature might be a couple of months. I think ultimately what we're looking at is, are we doing things in a private, secure way that lets enterprises particularly be comfortable with the technology and utilize the technology so they're not going to damage their brand or anything like that?
Yeah, it is interesting that I do agree with you, the sense of they do talk about the race, but a race indicates that there'll be a finish line. And I can't see a finish line. In fact, I can't see there was ever a finish line from the beginning of the internet through to today. But even before that, in terms of just, any form of the industrial revolution or the electronic revolution or the digital revolution, there's never really a finish line. It's just technology keeps shifting and moving forward. It is interesting to see, though, that there was, if you were to look at it as a race, there was definitely a sprint at some point when OpenAI did their thing, and everyone is now looking to catch up to that thing. Google's relationship with GPT as a methodology, as opposed to the GPT that OpenAI have well marketed. 2017, you guys released a whole load of research and papers around generative pre-trained transformers, and talk us through how Google have perceived that in the market, that you guys were ahead of the time, and then ultimately the marketing race changed, evidently coming back up to speed with everything right now, but that must hurt a little bit, right?
Yeah, it's funny how that's become a little bit of the narrative. If I look at what Google's got, so you talk about, if you're going to use the race analogy, let's talk about the things that are in our kit bag. So everything from the infrastructure and developing silicon-based infrastructure all the way up to the LLM, Google's got that capability all the way up. And you see some of our competitors launching infrastructure offerings now. I mean, we're up to version 5 of that infrastructure offering. That's been around for a period of time. So we've done that learning. We've got those processes in place to build that out and continue to innovate all the way up to an LLM. So we've got Gemini, obviously, which is a phenomenally powerful piece of technology. The ability to use that integrated stack, both from a cost control perspective and then also how we build that into our products that are consumer facing and how quickly we can learn, I'd say we're reasonably well positioned.
And I would as a service provider that partners with all the major cloud providers, Vertex AI with Gemini and all the other models that are supported through Vertex, which is the orchestration stack of Google for its AI infrastructure or its composable AI stack, is exceptionally capable. And it is evident that the underlying history that you have with infrastructure has got to that point. And that can only be a bigger asset going forward, as a lot of the market almost, they're not necessarily racing at the LLM level, they're racing at the compute level, which is cool. How many chips can we buy? How can we get the investment in to train these super large language models? Because the more compute you train on, the more IQ points drop out the bottom. There's probably no bigger, well, there's 3 of you really have got the compute power to make this work. And that's interesting in terms of the amount of investment that Google are making across the world around how much compute is going into your infrastructure. Around that investment, is New Zealand, in your view, going to have this technology be able to be domiciled here, or are we going to be reliant upon the US, Australia for having their AI capability offshore? What's your take?
Well, does it matter? I mean, if we look at technology now, technology is offered, enterprise technology and consumer technology is offered from anywhere in the world. And I'll just come back to what you said there around Vertex AI, and I love the fact that you enjoy the tech. You're obviously very familiar with the tech and the Superhuman team. You built a very nice living white paper using large language models, which is a phenomenally exciting idea. And you think about what that can bring to research, where again, I mean, Google is phenomenally strong. You talk about this race and perhaps Google or an organization getting the jump on Google in terms of a marketing perspective, but look at the fundamental research that's coming out of Google DeepMind as an example. That is game changing. The applications of the technology, not just someone saying, "Hey, write me a creative poem for my daughter's 16th birthday." Actually seeing what the technology is doing, and Google DeepMind releasing these phenomenal capabilities, protein, how building proteins, and how do we match these phenomenal? You see what they're doing in the Great Barrier Reef around the modelling for climate change. We look at a bunch of organisations in New Zealand, including yours, leveraging the Vertex AI, but also working on the conservation of the kakapo. That came out of Google, that used Google research, and that's research that's come out of New Zealand, which is enormously exciting from our perspective. It's taking the technology and putting it to an application rather than just having some nice tech that says, "Hey, let's POC something that the CEO wants to do."
Yeah, I don't think that's fair. Is that the consumer experience of AI is relatively lightweight and possibly more embedded than you would think in other tooling, but it's still quite lightweight. And this is probably a bad analogy, but I use it most days. But until I can find a better one, I'll use it. I remember when I was in the computer lab, like back in 1996, and the internet was a thing, and they kind of walked you into a computer room and were like, "Right, here's a search engine." And I'm like, "Cool, go and search for stuff." I'm like, "I don't know what to search for. What's the other side of the browser? I don't know." And we're going through that consumer journey of people understanding, well, it's no different from how you approach a prompt window today. How do I know what the art of the possible is with this technology until I really start to embed it into my workflow? And just people aren't there yet. They're not there are some outliers that are really embedding it. But from a deep research perspective, where it's a case of, this is a force amplifier to get to the outcome, I think it's fair to say that their use cases are hardcore and are being used in small communities but deeply, whereas the 8 billion people across the world have really just started to scratch the surface about how powerful this could be. Businesses will catch up.
Well, I'll give you a fun example. So we had the Prime Minister up in Singapore probably a month or so ago, and the Singaporean government is, really world leading. They stepped into a relationship with Google, and that was in around July last year. So they've been doing this for almost a year. They work closely with us, both public and private partnerships, so private enterprise as well. And we were at a presentation, and the chief deputy CE for the Singaporean government, she was presenting and presented to the PM and otherwise, and she was telling a story about when they were gathering use cases, as most organisations are doing now. Hey, let's get a few use cases, let's POC what those were. They were doing this in July last year. So basically, as soon as it came out, they said, let's adopt this. And they were ranking these use cases that they got. And one of them was, have you ever lived in Singapore?
No, I have not.
So in Singapore, I haven't either, but in Singapore, apparently booking a badminton court is a massive challenge.
Yeah.
It's a huge challenge. So booking a badminton court came as something, can we use an LLM to do this?
Money, yep.
So they went, okay, well, this is probably going to sit a little bit lower down the stack. But as they went into it, they realised that the request had come around not necessarily booking a badminton court, but it's booking a badminton court in the language and in the way that person is most comfortable with. So Singapore is obviously a diverse society, as is New Zealand. And they thought, hang on a second, if we've got a portal here that people can engage with in the language of they're most comfortable in, and also in the way that they're most comfortable, whether that be voice, whether that be text and otherwise, can we enable something that then we can perhaps use more widely in government? And what they were talking about was their ideal future is you go to google.com, you see a search, you just see a single search bar. Imagine engaging with government through one single search bar. And when I say engaging with government, we're talking transport, we're talking health, we're talking all of the different government services through a single search bar in the language and in the way that you're most comfortable with. That is phenomenally exciting. That unlocks so much potential for those. I've lived overseas. I lived in France for a while. I'll tell you, when I first arrived in France, the biggest challenge was the phone would ring and you'd go, oh my goodness.
Anxiety.
Anxiety. Oh, I've got no context. We're not looking at each other across here. I don't know what you're talking about. So it's just that language. To unlock something where someone can go, do you know what? I'm comfortable engaging with government because I can do it in the language that I want. That is phenomenally exciting. So that's the example of, I think, where the technology is going to take us and the steps that we need to get there. I think from a Google perspective, given the properties that we've got that are consumer facing, it's a natural place for us to fit.
Yeah. And how's that translating to here, in your view?
So we're working with a number of local organisations, and I think about organisations that are on the record. Zeal, which is an HR startup, Anna Mowbray and team have done a phenomenal job, kind of with our technology to launch that. That's really exciting. If I look global as well, we've got names like Uber. So think about how you engage with Uber at the moment, that app-based experience, and all the different Uber properties, Uber Eats and otherwise. Can they improve and do things via chat and engage with you in a number of different ways? That's being built on our technology as well. So we've got a number of organisations here. Trade Me, Fletcher's, Foodies, a lot of the big organisations in New Zealand are innovating and thinking about how they can reimagine their consumer engagement with us.
I think it's fascinating to see that the biggest barrier to any technology adoption that I've ever seen has been, one, businesses' willingness to change, but also if you look at the last big transformation that I guess not the best, no, that's not fair to say. The biggest transformation opportunity that's happened over the last 10 or 15 years has been this mythical digital transformation, which was, okay, cool, well, let's go in and put a load of budget into digitally transforming, which actually, as a guy that ran businesses through that was doing those digital transformations, it was shifting from CapEx to OpEx. That was the transformation.
And would you say it was top-down led in terms of consumer led, or do you think it was bottom-up led in terms of, hey, let's just shift our infrastructure, or let's shift these VMs from our on-premise to someone else's?
I think there's a percentage of both. And And I'll walk you through what that means. I think there was an element of shadow cloud usage, which was we've already started using it because it needs to happen, and therefore now we're going to shut down our data centers. The majority of was I'm no longer writing $2 million checks every year to keep my data center open and do a hardware refresh. And we know next year we need to drop $5 million on tin. Now's the time to spend $5 million migrating to the cloud. So it was a CFO decision as opposed to a business decision, because ultimately the apps that were run weren't ran in a different way. There was operating system exists here. It now exists here. So the reason.
So Dave, let me challenge you a little bit on that. How much of that is based on what the consumer needs or what the customer needs?
Oh, zero of it. Yeah.
It's like buying a new warehouse.
Yeah.
You kind of have to do it, so you spend the money. And ultimately, I'm sure there's a benefit. But really, I mean, you talk about digital transformation.
No.
It's not really.
No.
It's CapEx.
Well, the consumer in my example was not actually the consumer. It was engineering that were consuming, like business services from IT.
Yep.
So there was no concept of like the actual business's consumer. Whereas we look at what's in front of us today. The actual customer has the buying power. Like, I don't like interacting with this app. I don't like interacting with this website. I can tell it was built on, legacy technology. I want this conversational interface that I can literally don't have to think. And those versions of chatbots that essentially were built on logic have now not built on logic, and they're wholly intuitive. People will vote with their feet, and people do vote with their feet. They voted with their feet with Blockbuster. They voted with their feet with taxi companies and Uber. And they're going to vote with their feet a lot quicker when these interfaces come around. It's unfortunate, though, from a government perspective, you can't really vote with your feet too much there, other than emigrating. So is there going to be an impetus for the biggest productivity gain to come from those that haven't got a competitive threat to this?
Yeah, government's going to be. I agree with you. Government's going to be an interesting one. I mentioned Singapore. The advantage Singapore has is it's a lot more command and control than New Zealand. I'm not going to get into a political conversation here. This is absolutely not the place for it. But looking at what this government needs to achieve, we see a significant set of silos across all the different agencies. Agencies doing things here that could potentially be replicated or brought together to achieve some of those economies of scale. That's a kind of a government decision, how much they want to drive in that path. But I do think government will follow a little bit more. But in terms of that consumer experience and the chatbots, Google we like to refer to agents more than chatbots. And if you think about an agent working on your behalf, whether that be your personal assistant, but also agents working with other agents. So when we start bringing these models together and models working with other models to achieve things on our and your behalf, that's where the power is going to become unleashed. And then the properties that we have, again, and I've spoken about Maps and YouTube and Workspace and a whole bunch of Google properties, seeing how some of these can work together and interact, that is enormously exciting. Yep. That's where I think, again, it's not going to be a race, but that's where I think we're going to go, and you're going to see that in the next 3, 6, 12 months. More and more it's going to be inbuilt. I often ask executives around the table, and you can definitely see in terms of age, the comfort. The question I ask is, how many of you use generative AI on a regular basis? And whether that's ChatGPT or whether that's Gemini or whatever it is. And I would say in most senior audiences or most executive audiences, there'd be 1, maybe 2 out of the 10. If you go and ask my kids, you ask my 16-year-old, it's all the time. It's basically their homework assistant. And you think about how that's going to change and how it's going to be inbuilt. So I say, it doesn't matter what tech you use. Start to become familiar with, start to use it, because when you're a subject matter expert and you can think about how that technology is going to help you, that's where you're going to unlock massive gains. Waiting for IT to do it? No.
So interesting that you mentioned kids, education, and what that means from a heritage at Google has been their approach to educational technology. Chromebooks, I remember them when they first got launched. They're essentially like half the price of a PC and fully embedded in the Google community and the app ecosystem. How do you see Google's approach to education, being that right now I think that inflection point of AI is a threat to education, but also a massive force amplifier? What's the Google strategy or thinking around whether this is a good thing for education, not necessarily a bad thing?
So we step very carefully around education, and our view is our AI needs to be responsible. And we can talk about regulation later if you want, but responsible AI is really important to us. So when we think about Chromebooks and when we think about our education offering, at the moment we've said that this is going to be for 18 and above. So it's going to be teachers' assistants. It's going to be for tertiary education rather than primary or secondary, because when we know we have a responsibility to that audience, that global audience, and I think I'm right in saying that around 90% of New Zealand primary and secondary use the Google tooling. So we have a massive responsibility that when we make this available to that market, we absolutely get it right. So, but that market is going to be the market that becomes the tertiary and becomes the workforce of the future. And they're going to be the ones that come in with these expectations that say, hey, I've used this in my schooling, I've used this in my personal life. Why is this not in my professional life? But in terms of education specifically, at the moment, it's the workspace, particularly around workspace, Google for Education, it's 18 and above.
Right. Okay. Got it. So, question for you. We've got the majority of people, stats time, the majority of people that listen to this are business leaders, mainly working in the executive space. And a constant question we get asked all the time around this podcast is called, give me the use cases. Give me the practical things that people are doing. I think you mentioned it earlier on in terms of the vanilla use case of generative AI is relatively lightweight. Tell me a dad joke, give me a recipe for this, etc. But when you apply it in a deep and meaningful way, the results can be pretty fascinating. What's your guidance to those listening in terms of where they should start about thinking how this can be applied in their business? Like, how are you and your sellers and the rest of the team at Google approaching this with your clients?
So we've got a bunch of use cases that are relatively common use cases. Things like document search, things like contact centers, making those call centers more productive. I take a step back though, and when you talk to an executive audience, often, and I'll except for this audience listening, obviously, who know everything about their business. But for an individual who's sitting in the C-suite, they don't know necessarily what a day-to-day person's doing on the warehouse floor or on the printing floor, or who's driving a truck, or all those different parts, or even in the finance department. Those are the day-to-day people doing those tasks that will be able to think about, those subject matter experts, they will be able to think about, how does technology help me in my job right now? And them being able to adopt technology and build it into what they're doing. Yes, perhaps IT will have to set some guardrails, but we want to get to a point where the technology is so accessible that an individual can try and do something in their own role to improve their own role within an organization. So to answer your question specifically, talking to a C-suite or talking to an executive audience, you need to do two, in our view, you need to do two things. The first is go and explore the technology yourself. So you've got a bit of an understanding. And yes, you can go to different providers. Yes, you can go to some advisories, but go to multiple so you can get this education yourself. And the second thing is you need to digitally uplift the capability of your entire organization. Not just technology, not just C-suite, the entire organization. Those people sitting in finance, those people sitting in procurement, those people sitting all over the organizations. Because when you enable them, they can take that technology and create a use case which could perhaps be your next $1 million, $1 billion idea. That's what gets me so excited. It's getting this technology in the hands of not just technologists, but in the hands of everybody.
So what would your process be for, say, a business that's highly labor intensive? And it's labor intensive from a knowledge perspective. So say insurance or banking, where ultimately there's a lot of regulation, there's a lot of processes that are followed, but right now they're humanly driven. Because it seems to me that there's two trains of thought. One is make the same stuff go faster, which is the conversation that you've just had around how do you make those same manual processes become more productive and more efficient. And then there's the blank sheet of paper approach, which is, well, why do you need all of those processes in the first place if you're moving to a wholly digital workforce of agents interacting with agents? There strikes me of a situation where you could just make bad things go faster with this technology, as opposed to fully reimagining what it could mean to be an insurance company in 2024, or what it means to be a bank that starts tomorrow. And is it fair to say, or am I being doomistic with my thoughts, that if I'm a startup that wants to disrupt the banking industry, I essentially could build a $20 billion bank with 20 people. And that's the kind of thinking that I'm trying to get a sense of is, well, how much do we need executives to be thinking about that? Because that's what the next wave of startups is going to be thinking, because they haven't got these legacy processes that need to go faster. What's your take?
I don't think there's an appetite in the C-suite to completely disrupt your own organization. People talk about, yes, we need to disrupt ourselves, we need to digitally transform, et cetera, et cetera. But what they're not talking about is completely transforming the business model. There are incremental changes that can be made. And if we look at that individual productivity, if we can save a marketer, let's say they're spending 10 million a year or whatever that be, if we can save 3% of that spend by making their marketing more intelligent, understanding where that return on investment is coming from, that's an incremental saving. If we can make a saving in the supply chain, in those drivers, et cetera, that's an incremental saving. That's going to move the bottom line within an organization. So the kind of blue sky thinking, design thinking, hey, let's throw some ideas, let's completely reimagine. I'm not convinced necessarily it's the best use of everybody's time.
Yeah.
When people become more familiar with this technology and they can envisage how they can do their job better, that's where the value is going to come. I think what we can bring to that is examples of, hey, here's where other organizations are doing this. So let's come back to the example that Superhuman built, that living white paper. One of the major challenges that organizations have is, how do we enable better access to our internal and external documentation? And those knowledge workers that you referred to, there's a huge corpus of information that sits below them. Some of it up to date, some of it out of date, not sure where. Is it sitting on a shared drive somewhere? Where is it? How can I go and find that? If you think about Google search, that is our heritage. Next time you go and search for something, think about the oceans of data sitting behind that search bar. I mean, oceans.
Yep.
And the reason why Google search is so successful is because, almost without exception, the information that you get back is useful. So there's a lot of trust in what Google search does. So from an executive perspective, to go to your HR department or go to your procurement department or your legal department, whoever's got these significant documentation requirements, that's an easy place for us to start. It's getting information to people faster. We're doing a lot of work with marketers at the moment as well. Marketers spend an inordinate amount of time building briefs. How do we, what does our next campaign look like?
Not always good ones.
Well, yeah. So you got a spring campaign, you got an autumn campaign. But there'll be certain fundamentals that sit underneath that: the colors, the logos, et cetera, et cetera. We can train models to support that process and make that process faster. That's things we're doing right now with marketing departments here in New Zealand.
So if I was to summarize the thinking then, is that there's immediate or relatively immediate productivity gains to be had by embedding this technology within different operational departments and then having the tide rise on everyone. But buyer beware, there is potential threat and opportunity on the side of brand new businesses coming in that are going to hurt you, but don't necessarily waste your time just on the big picture thinking. That's what I'm hearing. Yeah,
I think so. And the disruption story is a good story, but
it's also a clickbaity story, which isn't useful. It's not the intention of why you have the conversation, but it is if you look at the short time that technology is. Not to kind of refresh this one, because every audience member here will have seen this. First 100 million users to the credit card and first 100 million users of PayPal. Like the time gets shorter, but therefore does the threat vector tighten? As in, is there an opportunity for me to be out of business in 6 months as opposed to 6 years? Who knows with that? And that's the bit that I'm thinking about is, well, is this how insurance is going to work in 2030? Do I need 20,000 people in my business to manage underwriting? Is that how it's going to be? Or do I need to be thinking as a CEO of an insurance company, okay, I need to fully think about how this business transitions to something that the likelihood of a competitor coming in and having a 0-person contact center and a 0-person underwriting department is likely when you go down an agent-to-agent scenario. And when do you start thinking about that?
Well, so I mean, it's absolutely worth thinking about, and I think it's worth taking the time because each industry is different. Each industry is rife for disruption. You raised financial services. There have been disruptors coming into financial services over the last millennia. And yet, even here in New Zealand, you've still got the big banks that continue to do business. Will they lose some market share to upstarts? Potentially, but they'll also have an opportunity to change. What we talk about to those types of organizations is, okay, you can think about being disrupted, but what do you need to do as an established, and legacy has negative connotations, but you're a legacy business if you've been around for a while and you've got legacy systems and
the carrying technical debt.
Yeah, the carrying technical debt. So what are you doing right now about getting your systems into a position where you can enable or you can utilize this technology? And data is an obvious one. Data has historically been a massive challenge for organizations. And there are always the latest technologies that come in that say they're going to solve it. But what you ultimately want is not necessarily a data swamp, a data lake. You want something that brings data pieces together that are useful at the right time. And I come back to that search example. Coming from the top down, coming from the consumer down, and tying bits and pieces of that together, I think that's where organizations need to think, not the responsibility of IT, think about it from a specific use case. And I'll come back to marketing. Marketers have an enormous amount of data at their fingertips that, if they use better, can make them far more productive. If they connected, for example, sales data, where they can see they've done a campaign in Auckland and they've done a campaign in Wellington, as an example, and the campaigns are different, how do they tie those campaigns to sales data? That's the dream of every marketer. I dial it up here and I dial it down there, and I can see what happens to sales. That's the type of thing that is enormously valuable. What's that old expression? Half of every marketing budget's wasted. We just don't know which half.
Right. Yeah.
That's the thing. If we can reduce that half down to less, that's an opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, I do feel for Google, and I feel for Microsoft, and I feel for AWS and all the big players. It's difficult for us to keep up, and we are an AI-only solutions provider. We've got an ear to the ground all of the time on all the changes. You've done us a great service by firstly reading us into the changes that are happening, but also giving us access to Google I/O and your smart engineers to help us work with clients. I must say it's been a privilege working with Google on the LLM white paper piece of work. Thank you for bringing the tech. We definitely weren't surprised, but we were definitely, I'll call it, reassured with how capable Vertex AI was. And it's great to see you're bringing more and more models all of the time. Appreciate you guys, appreciate your work, and thanks for joining us. If you're up for it, over the course of the next 6 months, we'll get you on again to kind of look at the changes that are happening in the Google landscape, and to keep us updated with all the cool stuff that Google are doing with customers right here in New Zealand, and make sure we can connect marketing material to what's happening on the ground.
Would love to. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.